So, the year is 2025, and Intel has released yet another Arc GPU, the B570. And this one's going to be pretty interesting because it comes with 10GB of VRAM and a price of around $219, which is a price range that we really haven't seen lately. Now, the main GPUs that we're going to be comparing today is the A750, which is the last generation Alchemist GPU, the RX 6600, which is currently the best value GPU you can get at $189, the RTX 3060 12GB, and of course we'll have the 4060 up in comparison, as well as the RX 7600. And to top it all off, we've got the B580 as well, which is the older brother to the new B570. Now, the 3060 12GB can be bought for $215 USD used, but I really wouldn't consider it brand new at $280, because at that point you might as well buy a B580, which will get you a better GPU all around, plus that additional 12GB of VRAM anyway. But it's clear that the B570 is pretty much a cut down B580, but in terms of value, it really depends on how well the B570 performs, which we'll see later on in the video. The 3060 12GB might also be a little bit competitive, having 2GB more VRAM than the new B570, and in addition has a higher memory bus. But like I said, you only really want to be getting the 3060 used. So we're going to be comparing the used value compared to the brand new value of the B570. The 4060 also might be a good comparison to the B570, again coming with 2GB more VRAM and better specs overall and a higher memory bus. And the 7600 might also be interesting, as the B570 additionally has better specs. And both these GPUs, especially the 4060, do cost considerably more. The 4060 coming in at $300 and the 7600 coming in at $249. Now, going back to the B580, it will be interesting to see just how far apart these are in terms of performance, considering that the B580 is only a little bit more expensive than the B570. Now, on the B580, Hardware Unbox actually pointed out that using an older generation Ryzen 5 5600 netted much worse performance compared to a 9800 X3D, which is what most reviewers use on the B580 review. Which is why later on in this video, we're going to be comparing the performance of the four main GPUs that we're comparing today: the 3060, the 6600, the B570, and the A750 versus 9800 X3D performance and 5600X performance, to see the performance drop off on the new B570. So first, we're starting off with the 9800 X3D testing, and in CS2 at 1080p high settings versus the 3060 12GB, we actually lost by 2% in averages, versus the A750 outpaced by 10% on average, but versus 6600 we got a pretty mediocre 6% uplift in averages. In F124, again versus 3060 we lost by 2%, but versus A750 we got 4% higher averages, but versus 6600 with about 18% higher averages. Shadow of the Tomb Raider saw an uplift versus the 3060 12GB by 4% on averages, and a much wider gap versus the A750 with a 26% gain on the B570, but only a very marginal gain versus 6600 by around 10% on averages. Now in Cyberpunk at the high preset, leading by around 15% on average versus 3060, 20% on average versus A750, and a massive 34% versus 6600. In Far Cry 6, the B570 continues this lead over the 3060 12GB, but unfortunately in 1% lows, we lost by almost 56%, which does reveal some sort of an optimization issue here in Far Cry 6. But if I remember from my last video with the B580, it was pretty consistent with that too. Versus A750, we got 40% higher averages, and versus 6600, we got 17% higher averages. In COD Black Ops 6 at the balance preset, we got about 7% higher averages versus the 3060, and we got a much better experience versus A750 with almost 60% higher averages. But AMD seems to have the advantage in Black Ops 6, with the B570 losing to the 6600, but it did have higher lows, so that is something to point out. In Forza 5, we were pretty close to the 3060 12GB, but the B570 did outpace it by 2% and picked up against the A750 by 23% in averages. Now in our 7-game average for 1080p, we see that the B570 picked up a 3.2% win against the 3060 12GB, a 21% win against the A750, and about an 11% win against the RX 6600. So overall, against our three main competitors for this video, the B570 is is going to be noticeably better. But versus the 4060 and 7600, it can't quite catch up. But that's to be expected. And versus the B580, the B570's older brother, the B570 lost by around 9.3%. So really against the B580, there isn't such a huge delta. Now rasterized for 1440p is pretty much the same, we'll just become more GPU bound here. So the gap will start to widen drastically here. And CS2, the 3060 still claims the win against the B570, but again, it catches up in lows. Against the A750, the B570 takes an 8% uplift. Versus 6600, it takes a 20% uplift. And versus the 4060, while of course we lost in averages, in lows, the B570 actually outpaced it, which is pretty interesting. And the same can be said about the RX 7600, the B570 outpacing it in lows, but losing by 3% in averages. In F1, the B570 outpaced the 3060 by 2% in averages, and quite substantially in lows too. Versus the A750, it took an 11% win, and versus the RX 6600, the B570 outpaces it by 27%, and we got quite close to the 7600 in terms of averages and lows. Shadow of the Tomb Raider shows the B570 taking an 8% lead over the 3060, a 21% lead over the A750, another 23% lead over the 6600, and gets extremely close to the 7600, and it lost to the 4060, which is again to be expected. In Cyberpunk, the B570 took a 27% lead over the 3060, a 13% lead over the A750, and a massive 54% lead over the 6600. We even outpaced the 4060 by 11.3% in averages, and the 7600 by 10% on average. In Far Cry 6, we continue to see the struggle with lows, outpaced the 3060 in averages by around 6%. We lost by around 50% in lows, which isn't that good. We continued to outpace the A750 though, and the 6600 at least in averages by 19%, but even versus 6600, we lost by 42% in lows. In Black Ops 6, we got high averages by 13% versus 3060, with a much more rounded experience versus A750 by 34% overall. But AMD continues to put up a fight here, but the B570 does outpace the 6600 at least, by 6% on averages. In Forza Horizon 5, the B570 takes a healthy lead by 8% on average versus the 3060 12GB, 19% on average versus the A750, and 12% on average versus 6600, while beating the 7600 by around 2%, but still losing to the 4060 by around 8%. In our 7-game average for 1440p, we see around a 6% lead over the 3060 12GB on the B570, and a 15% lead over the A750, all the while with a 21% uplift versus 6600. So with our three main competitors once again, we're seeing a really healthy uplift in performance over some of these other GPUs. Versus the 4060 and 7600 though, even versus those two more expensive GPUs, we're still putting up a massive fight here. So really impressive performance here. Now looking at performance per dollar, we see the B570 is genuinely a good value compared to some of these other GPUs. Even the 3060 12GB while used at $215, you're getting 4.1% more value, and versus the A750 at $200, you're getting 8.5% more value. But versus 6600, you're getting about the same performance per dollar. So the ball is in your court on whether or not you want the B570 to get those 2GB extra VRAM, or you want to pay a little bit less for the 6600 and get about the same sort of performance per dollar. Versus the 4060, you're going to have monumentally better value, and even versus 7600, you're going to get slightly more value. Now another option that you might want to consider is getting a 3060 Ti while used, which nets you at around $240 US, and that in general is going to be a much better value than either the 6600 or B570. But again, you're getting 2GB less VRAM, and of course you're getting a used GPU, which comes with its cons as well. And versus the B580, it is in general going to be a better value. So again, the ball is in your court on whether or not you want to pay that extra money to get an additional 2GB extra VRAM on top of the 10 to make it 12GB of VRAM, which does additionally improve the longevity of the GPU, and overall you're getting a better GPU anyway. Now looking at performance per watt, none of these GPUs really are a cause for concern, so you can skip this part if you want, but overall the B570 is in general a pretty good efficient card, so it goes to show the XE2 improvements that Intel has had here. But the 6600 is going to be slightly more efficient, and if you're considering a 3060 Ti used, well, well, it's going to be a lot more efficient than that as well by 30%. So that's something to keep in mind too. Now, ray tracing at 1080p is going to be a little bit more interesting. The B570 actually outpaced the 3060 by 3% in terms of averages in F1, and it's going to be in general a lot better ray tracing versus the A750, beating it by 18% in averages. And versus 6600, which in general AMD seems to have a massive disadvantage in ray tracing, so it's no surprise here, you're going to get 84% better averages, so a monumentally better experience while ray tracing. In Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the B570 outpaced the 3060 by around 8% and got considerably better lows as well. And versus the A750, you're going to get a much better experience here as well by around 22%. And versus 6600, once again, you're getting a much better experience by around 30 to 40% overall. In Cyberpunk, the B570 outpaced the 3060 by 18%, the A750 by 28%, and the 6600 by 85%, which is really impressive. And against the 4060, the B570 actually won by 2%, while beating the 7600 by 32% in averages. In Far Cry 6, the B570 ultimately lost by the 3060, so the issue with optimization is consistent even with ray tracing on the B570. For whatever reason, we lost by the A750 by 11% on average, so that could be an issue of the new architecture not being fully taken advantage of yet in this title. We also lost by the 6600 by around 13%, which was pretty interesting. So in our 4-game average FPS, the B570 lost by 7% on average, but we gained over the A750 by 13%, and the 7600 by almost 15%, which was really good. And ultimately, the 6600 by around 34%. The 4060 still takes the cake when it comes to ray tracing as well. Now, ray tracing at 1440p, starting with F1, the B570 outpaced the 3060 by 8.2%. It also outpaced the previous gen A750 by 26% in averages, and almost 140% in averages versus 6600, which was really impressive. Now, in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the B570 once again picked up against the 3060 by 14% on average, and outpaced the A750 by around 21%, and the 6600 by around 35%. We also outpaced the 7600 once again by 6% on average. In Cyberpunk with 1440p ray tracing, we saw a 32% uplift versus the 3060, a 30% uplift versus the A750, and 155% uplift versus the 6600. We even outpaced the 4060 by 18% and the 7600 by around 65%. Now in Far Cry 6, the B570 unfortunately lost to the 3060 by 40%, and actually once again lost by the A750 by 30%, and the 6600 by around 5%. In our 4-game average FPS, the B570 unfortunately lost to the 3060 by around 1%, but it did gain against the A750 by around 10%, and even the more expensive 7600 by around 17%. It also led by the 6600 by around 46%, and got in the rear view mirror of the 4060, only really losing by around 1%. In our ray trace summary, the B570 overall is going to have less value versus buying again a 3060 Ti used. Even versus a 3060 12GB used, you're getting less value. That's if you can find it for $215 while used. Versus the A750, you're getting pretty much the same performance per dollar here. But versus the 6600, you're getting considerably more value. Now for efficiency or performance per watt, again, you can skip this part if you don't really care about it. But the B570 is genuinely more efficient than the 6600 and considerably versus the 7600 by almost 50%. Now we also wanted to take a look at frame generation performance, which is definitely relevant because Intel has recently released their new XeSS 2. So we tested the previous gen NVIDIA cards on FSR 3 frame gen, 40 series on DLSS 3.5 frame gen, and the Intel cards on the new XeSS 2 frame gen. So the B570 with XeSS 2 versus the 3060 with FSR 3 frame gen, we got about 27% higher averages, but unfortunately, we got much lower lows compared to the 3060. And if you look at our previous video, where we compared display latency compared to FSR 3 and XeSS 2 frame gen, we saw that there was more latency using the new technology. So clearly there's some issues that Intel hasn't ironed out yet. But hopefully in the future, these will change, because there's definitely some potential here with the pretty good averages. Versus the A750, we got 21% higher averages, and compared to the 6600 while using FSR versus our 3 frame gen, the B570 was ahead by 86%. So your actual experience you're going to have won't actually be that far off compared to something like a 6600, but at the very least your averages are a lot higher. Now this is the part of the video where we compare CPU overhead, or the 9800X3D, which is what we use for testing normally, versus the 5600X. Now we won't compare every single game as this video is already long enough, so we'll have that in a separate video, where in addition to comparing each and every game, we're also going to add in a couple of other CPUs. So like this video and get subscribed because you won't want to miss it. In our 7 game average at 1080p, netted around a 9% decrease in performance. And this actually brings us performance level a lot closer to something like the 6600 when using a 5600X. At 1440p, it's a bit of a different story, as we didn't see much of a difference comparing the two CPUs. We got about the same performance. When comparing the actual performance per dollar with just solely the GPUs, we see that in both 1080 and 1440, the B570's value drops by around 6%, which is pretty considerable. And like I said, it brings it in line pretty much where the 6600 is in terms of value, or even lower than that. At the very least, we're getting still higher performance per dollar than the A750. Now this time comparing ray tracing performance. Starting with 1080p, we see that performance is mostly within margin of error. We didn't seem to gain or lose any performance. Now this might be because we're so GPU limited, it's using every part of the GPU to render the frames, but the CPU definitely is relevant here. Looking at 1440p, it's pretty much the same. Most of them are within margin of error, but looking at the value really doesn't seem to change. We actually gained value when using a 5600X. So it's only really when we're in sort of CPU limited scenarios, while ray tracing or at higher resolutions, it starts to become less prevalent, but not everyone is going to be turning on ray tracing because of the massive performance hit. So the deficit you get while using a lower end CPU is going to matter a lot more for people that are playing in 1080p rasterization. So keep that in mind. Now quickly going over benchmarks, in Blender, the B570 sadly lost to the 3060 by around 37%, and even lost to the A750, most likely because it has less shady units, but it did outperform the 6600 by 33%, and even the 7600 by 6.7%. The 4060 is in a league of its own, but of course, Nvidia's integration of CUDA and optics is going to make a massive difference here, so it's no surprise there. Now, PureBench for Premiere Pro with the GPU effects score, which is going to look at how 3D rendering performance and encoding performance go hand in hand. We see the 3060 12GB overall is going to have a better experience, and even less performance versus the A750, but you are going to have more performance on the B570 versus 6600 and even the 7600 by 14%. Now for overclocking. The overclocking we managed to achieve was about a 20% uplift in voltage, a 12% uplift in power limit, a 150 MHz bump in frequency, and about 1 gigabits per second uplift in memory. It increased power by around 16% on average, which isn't too bad, and that brings us around to where the power limit is in general. And thermals, while under an ambient temp of 23.5 degrees Celsius, only really increased by around 8% on average. So in general, on this ASRock card, power thermals aren't really going to increase, if at all, when overclocking. And our average FPS at 1440p went up by around 8%, which basically brought it to where the 4060 and 7600 perform, so that's really impressive. And it widens the gap over the 3060 and A750 and even the 6600 considerably. So pretty much that's the B570. It trades blows with the 3060 12GB. Sometimes it has high average FPS, but like in Far Cry 6, like we pointed out, it has lower 1% lows, which could hint at optimization issues. And in addition to that, it trails the 4060 and even 7600 and is quite close to the B580, which does add some cause for concern considering there's such a little gap between those two GPUs that you might be better off just getting a B580. If they just priced it a little bit more competitively, maybe priced it at $200, it might be a lot more competitive. But overclocking does sort of narrow that gap and brings it closer to something like a 4060 and 7600. The new XeSS2 frame generation, like we explored in the previous videos, does help with its performance, but obviously there's still some issues when it comes to 1% lows. That's something that we found. in that last video, so go watch that video if you want to. And like I said, price to performance was pretty much on par with the 6600, and that's something that I was concerned about, especially at 1080p. It's also slightly less power efficient than the 4060 and even the 6600, but I don't think anyone gives a shit, to be honest. But also there's a massive elephant in the room, and that's this issue with CPU overhead. It's clear that when you're using a lower end CPU, you do get a bit of a drop in performance. We got around 8.6% drop in performance going from the 9800X3D to 5600X at 1080p. But once you start to climb the ladder at 1440p and then eventually into ray tracing performance, it becomes less prevalent because you become less CPU bound and more GPU bound. And the value of the B570 ultimately decreases by quite a lot, especially in rasterization. You eventually get less value than even a 6600. So that's definitely something that really needs to be pointed out. Whether or not that's to do with architecture, like the new XE2, optimization, I have no idea. It's really up to Intel to figure all that out. But the B570 overall, forgetting about the CPU overhead stuff and keeping in mind that they could potentially fix it in the future, the B570 is a good value. But just keep in mind, spending a little bit extra on something like the B580 might give you more longevity. But anyway, other than that, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this breakdown of this GPU. Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.